name's Rob Dodson. I'm a developer advocate at Google's. Here tonight to talk with you about accessibility, which is probably one of my favorite things to work on. I know not a lot of developers say that, but it's one of my favorite things to work on. This is my social info down there if you want to follow me on the Twitters or the G+, if anybody still uses G+. I don't think they do. Like a lot of you, I spend a lot of time designing components. And when I'm building components, I really like to obsess over the look and feel of the component and the animation and the performance, and making sure that it feels awesome for my users. And performance is kind of like a key aspect of good user experience. We know that we have data that shows that users will just abandon an app if it doesn't have the performance that they expect, right? But it's often the case that as we're designing these components, as we're building these applications, we're doing so based on our own experience and our own physical abilities. So we're designing for the range of users that really just see and interact with the world as we do. And so that means that anybody who's falling outside of that range is going to be excluded from our design. So these users aren't abandoning our app because it has poor performance or anything like that. They're actually prevented from using our app in the first place. And so I think as designers and developers, it's important that we not only consider how we interact with the world, but we really think about kind of the full range of human abilities when we're building stuff. So the way the World Health Organization defines disability is they say that it's not just a health problem, it's a complex phenomena reflecting the interaction between the features of a person's body and features of the society in which he or she lives. And so that means that disability is universal, and it means that it's always changing, and it means that it really does affect all of us. I'm sure many of you have had the experience of going outside and you're trying to use your phone in really bright sunlight. You got to kind of cover your eyes, right? And so in a situation like that, maybe you could use a bit more contrast on your screen, right? You got to fiddle with the brightness. So disability can be temporary. If you're trying to use your phone one-handed while you're holding a screaming baby, right? It makes no difference if you're holding a screaming baby or if you were someone with a motor impairment who might be paralyzed on one side of your body. It nets out to the same thing, right? Whether or not you can actually use this experience one-handed. So disability can also be situational, right? And so I like to think that accessibility is just fundamentally a part of building a good user experience. Working on accessibility is going to expose things that you probably overlooked in your application. It's going to force you to step outside of yourself and work with your app from a different perspective. And ultimately, that's just going to make whatever product you're building that much better. So this is what I want to talk about today. I'm going to split this up into a few different categories. The first is just looking at sort of the diverse range of users that are out there and touching on the accessibility topics that affect them. And then I want to move on to the two big areas that I see a lot of developers struggling with, which is focus and semantics. But I want to start just by understanding who are the users out there who rely on assistive technology, and what kind of technology do they use to overcome their impairments. So I'm going to focus on users with permanent disabilities here, but again, I want to reiterate that issues of accessibility really do affect all of us. And ensuring that these users have a great user experience is going to improve the user experience for everybody. But just to get some interesting numbers out there, so I know a lot of developers are like, should I even bother working on this? Are there even people that are using my app that have a disability or anything like that? But according to the World Health Organization, about 15% of the world's population has some form of disability. And so to put that in more concrete terms, that's about 1 billion people worldwide. And then we can roughly split that into about 4 different categories of disability or impairment. Those affecting visual senses, motor and dexterity, auditory senses, and cognition. I'm going to cover each of these sort of individually, starting with vision. So visual impairment can be split into really 2 buckets. You have users with no vision who are completely blind, or users with limited or low vision. So users with no vision are going to interact with the site using a screen reader. This is TalkBack on Android. It's a screen reader you can use by touch. Or they might use a braille display device, something like that right there. So that's users with no vision. Users with limited or low vision might use a screen reader, but they tend to maybe instead use screen magnification. They might use built-in OS zoom, or they might use browser zoom. They might also use something like high contrast mode. So you can see here in Gmail, the colors are inverted to make it easier to read the text on screen. They might also use text-to-speech and things like that to overcome that impairment. So that covers vision roughly. I want to talk about motor next. So motor impairments span the gamut from those who would prefer not to use a mouse because maybe they have like a repetitive stress injury, something like carpal tunnel, all the way to someone who might have actual like physical paralysis or some other form of motor impairment. So for these users, they might use head or eye tracking. So this is a device called Dasher, which is a head tracking device that allows you to type. It's actually following her eye as she's looking to the right there and typing for her. Or they might use a switch device to interact with content on the screen. So the page would be sort of like scanning around and you can tap a switch to select something. For users with auditory impairment, this range of folks is those who are profoundly deaf all the way through to folks who are hard of hearing. So I'm in the hard of hearing camp. I'm pretty much completely deaf on my left-hand side. For these users, you want to make sure that you're not relying solely on sound to convey information. So making sure if you've got video that you've got captions and a transcript for it. Providing some sort of alternative when you got sound as like a major part of your interface. And then cognitive impairment is really interesting. This is kind of a new area that a lot of folks are looking at because it's very broad, it's very diverse, and it's sort of difficult to quantify. But this spans conditions all the way from ADHD to dyslexia to autism, just to name a few. The accommodations for this group are pretty diverse, but you do find some overlap with other areas. So for instance, zooming the screen to make it easier to read and sort of minimize distraction and make it easier to concentrate. This is actually an extension for Chrome for dyslexia that adds colored gradients to aid in sort of like linear reading order, making sure that it's easier to sort of like scan down the page. So roughly speaking, these form kind of the major 4 categories of users we need to cater to when we're thinking about accessibility in our applications. But because accessibility is like pretty broad and the usership is obviously so diverse, it can be really helpful to have a guide to make sure that we are covering all of these groups, that we're not excluding any, and that we're not over-optimizing for one. So we find that in the form of this document, or this set of documents called the Web Content Accessibility Guidelines, or WCAG 2.0. This is a really comprehensive document. It basically, it was put together by accessibility experts to try and sort of answer the question of like what it means for an experience to be accessible. It's really comprehensive. It can also be totally overwhelming. Like anybody looking at that is like, that does not look like fun to read at all. And that's just like one piece of it. There's actually, I think, in terms of WCAG and supporting material, about 2,000 pages. So yeah, I don't think that's something most folks want to read. So instead, to aid in that, folks have taken WCAG and sort of distilled it down to stuff that web developers can use more easily. So the WebAIM group has created what's called the WebAIM WCAG checklist. So this is just a really simple checklist that tries to cover the major categories of WCAG. You can sort of like check it off for the apps that you're building. So if you're interested in accessibility, but you're new to it and you're not quite sure where to start, like one piece of advice would be to nail that checklist, right? So get the WebAIM checklist and then figure out what the primary user journeys are in your site. Don't just sort of look at the whole page and be like, I don't know, checking things off here and there. Figure out what the user journeys are. So if creating a new account is like a crucial journey that you want all of your users to be able to complete, look at the phases of that journey, and then as you're going through those phases, that's when you're checking things off of that checklist. So that's how you can figure out if you've got an accessible experience. And then just repeat that for the other primary and secondary use cases in your app. And do that for every step of your process. So having designers thinking about accessibility, I promise you, for everyone who's a developer in here, that will make your life so much easier than having someone come back after the fact and be like, hey, we got to make this thing accessible. And then you're like, what? So having it in the design phase, having it early, helps a lot. Okay, with that checklist in hand, I want to start talking about some of the actual practicalities that we need in order to make our apps accessible. So we'll talk a little bit about code now. And I want to start off by talking about this idea of focus. And like what it means for something to have focus in the browser and how that works. So when I was getting started with this, I really had sort of a vague notion of what focus meant. Like I knew it was a thing, but I wasn't quite sure what it meant for something to be focused. And so in a nutshell, focus really just determines where keyboard events go in the page. And so I've got like a text field here, for instance. If I go and I click on that text field, that act of clicking on it focuses it. You only ever have one thing that's ever focused at any time on your computer. So I focus that text field, and from here on out, as I'm typing on my keyboard, it sends the events to that element, and that element knows to display those characters. Now this is important because some users, folks with motor impairment, for instance, or someone using a screen reader, they drive their computer entirely using the keyboard, right? They can't use a mouse. And so for them, focus is absolutely critical. It's their primary means of just reaching everything on screen in your app. And so making sure you've got a really good focus order in your application is sort of like step number one of building an accessible experience. Now, a lot of the HTML that you use every day, a lot of the built-in elements that are interactive, so input, buttons, select, these are all implicitly focusable. You don't have to do anything special to make it so that a user can reach them using their keyboard. They're naturally inserted in the tab order. Any user pressing the tab or the shift-tab key on their keyboard can get to them just fine. They've also got built-in keyboard behavior, like select, you focus it, you can hit up and down arrow keys, right, and move around inside of it. But not all elements are focusable, and this is a really important thing to understand. So for instance, this header here, this paragraph of text, this picture, this cat, none of these are implicitly focusable, okay? And the reason is because you don't want to make something focusable if a user cannot interact with it. Imagine if you were trying to move around the screen using just your keyboard, but you could already see the screen, right? Having to tab through everything that you could already see would be very annoying. You would only want to tab to the interactive bits. So not everything is implicitly focusable, and that's good. It makes things more efficient. But this brings up a big problem, and this is a really important point. If you're going to build a control out of one of these elements, then that means that your keyboard users, your screen reader users are not going to be able to interact with it. So I'll give you an example here. This is like your classic responsive web app. And I've got a little hamburger menu over there, right, to open my side nav. And you can see my markup here that I've used a div to create that little hamburger mini button. But a div is just a sort of generic container. It's not implicitly focusable. So let's see, you can see my focus ring is right now on that start button. So let's see what happens as I'm trying to tab over and reach that thing. I will never be able to reach it. I'll never be able to open that side nav because I've just used a generic element there. So I see this on websites all the time. People create div buttons all the time, and it makes the whole site not usable. So there's a really easy fix for this. Just instead of using a div, you use just a button element. So now I can move focus over, and I can very easily, hit enter and open that thing. So button tag, you can style it, no problem, right? There is a little CSS involved, but what you're going to get out of that is accessibility for free, which is really nice. You also get a side benefit. The button element has magical properties when it comes to click handlers. If you add a click handler to a button element, someone focuses it with their keyboard, hits enter or spacebar, it will run your click handler. If, however, you make a div button and you actually get it into the focus order, and I'll talk about how to do that in a little bit, and you give it a click handler, someone hits enter or spacebar, nothing will happen. Because the browser actually has magic built in called synthetic click activation steps, I think is the term, that will actually run on click handlers for buttons when you press keyboard keys, because it assumes that that was the intent. So you're going to get free JavaScript out of, or save yourself some JavaScript from using the native element, and you'll get accessibility for free, which is nice. So the next time you are building a custom widget, you're like, I'm going to build a custom input, or I'm going to build a custom button, or something like that. Just like stop yourself and don't, because you're actually going to give yourself more work, and you're going to make the lives of your users more difficult. So just don't fight the platform here, because it's trying to help you out, right? That's why a lot of those elements have built-in behaviors. But I do realize there's times when there's not a native analog to what you're trying to build. You're going to have to build something custom. And so in those cases, it's important to make sure that you're adding back in that really useful keyboard support for your users. And so in that previous example, if we wanted to make that div button focusable, we could do that using the tabindex attribute. So tabindex just lets you opt an element into or out of the tab order. You can apply it to pretty much any HTML tag. And it takes kind of like a range of values. So tabindex of 0 will let you put an element into the natural tab order. So this is another one of these evil div buttons, right? Don't actually do this. But if I was to press the tab key right now, I couldn't focus this thing. If I gave it the tabindex of 0, and now I press the tab key, I can focus it. I get my nice focus ring and everything. I still shouldn't do this, but this is how you focus a div button. Tabindex of -1 means that your element is going to be programmatically focusable, but it will not be in the tab order. So someone can't hit the tab key to reach it. This can be useful if you're temporarily disabling a control, or if you're building a complex component, like a tree or something like that, something that doesn't already exist in the platform, and you want to use a technique called roving tabindex to actually allow you to manage focus inside of that component. So here I've got this list, and let's say the list contained 100 items. It'd be very inefficient for someone to have to tab through all of those items, especially if they're using like a switch device or something like that. That would suck. Instead, I only want the currently selected item to be focusable. So these are just kind of tabbing through the document. They land on this thing. If they want to bypass it, they can just keep pressing tab. Or if they want to interact with it, they could hit like the up and down arrow key. So to do that, I've got only the active item has tabindex of 0, and everything else is tabindex -1. And let's say the user lands on this thing and they hit the down arrow key. Then I can just move the tabindex 0 down to the next element, call its focus method, and then the other ones remain like not in the tab order. This technique is super, super, super useful if you're building any kind of complex control. Roving tabindex, I promise you, if you're trying to make anything accessible that is like a tree or anything like that, you'll probably end up using this. So good technique to have. Lastly, you can give a tabindex of like 5, but you should never ever do this. It's part of the spec, you can do it, and it's an awful, awful anti-pattern. Basically what it'll do is it'll jump that element ahead of everything else in the tab order. I don't even know why it exists, but you should never do it. But I wanted to include this slide just for completeness sake. You know that you have it there if you don't know. You know you have it there, but you should never use it. It's going to create a really confusing tab order, but more importantly, if someone's using a screen reader, they're actually not going to land on those elements in that order because the screen reader navigates the DOM in a linear fashion. So just forget that tabindex greater than 0 even exists. Now, when I first got into this, I had a bunch of components that I was trying to make accessible, and I just wasn't sure, like, what are the right patterns that I'm supposed to apply to those components, right? So if I am building a tree or a select or something like that, what support is expected of that component? And so there's this one magical document that is sort of like hidden in the ARIA specifications. This is the ARIA Authoring Practices Guide. This is, if you take nothing else away from this talk, this is the most important document in your life if you're trying to make anything accessible. And basically what it does is it just lists design patterns over on the left. So like accordion, alert, checkbox, whatever, right? You pick a design pattern, and then it'll take you to a section, and it'll just tell you all the keyboard support that you need. So it's like, if you're building a checkbox and someone hits the tab key, this is what should happen. Or if they hit the escape key, this is what should happen, right? It'll tell you the ARIA attributes that need to be applied and when. So anyway, this document is your guide to accessibility. This is your cheat sheet right here. I'll show that again later because it's so good. Okay, so I mentioned ARIA. Maybe I've said it a few times now, but I haven't really explained what that is. So ARIA, I'll get into it in a little bit, but ARIA really relates to like the semantics of an element. And this was another thing that for me was like kind of like a Swiss cheese hole in my knowledge of how the web worked. I was always like, people talk about semantics, but I'm not really sure why it's important. Like I don't, like, who benefits from good semantics? Why can't I just build everything out of a div, you know? So what does it mean for something to have good semantics, and how does that actually benefit people? To answer that question, you've got to understand this idea of affordances. And a teapot is like the classic great example of affordances. An affordance basically is something that affords or it sort of offers someone an opportunity to interact with an object. And a teapot is a good example because a teapot has a handle on it, right? And because you've all seen other things with handles, or you've interacted with other things with handles at some point in your life, no one has to explain to you how a teapot works. Basically, just based on its physical shape, you can kind of infer how you should interact with this thing. It has a spout, and you can kind of infer that something's going to come out of that because you've seen other things with spouts. So the handle and the spout, these are all affordances, right? They tell you how to use the thing without actually instructing you. So when we build graphical user interfaces, we have to add those affordances back in, and we do that visually. So when you're building a button, you'll add some CSS to make it kind of like look like it's raised off of the page, right? It makes it look like a real button you could actually click on. So that's you adding a visual affordance to that element. But the problem is if someone is unable to see the screen, then they're gonna just miss out on those visual affordances that you've spent a lot of that time adding in there. So we have to come up with a way, or we have to make sure that the elements that we're building are sort of contain the information that's needed and that they're flexible enough to sort of express those affordances programmatically. And so we basically call that, you know, an element expressing its semantics. And this is why semantics become very, very important. So I'll give you an example here. This is some HTML for creating a select element. And you know, the browser's going to see this, and it will generate a visual UI with its own visual affordances built into it. But because I've used good semantic elements here, the browser is also able to generate a spoken UI based on the semantics that are built into those elements. So roughly speaking, for every HTML tag, there's a few really semantic properties that they actually contain. An element is going to have a role. So this select element has a role of pop-up button. So this is actually part of its accessibility object that the browser is creating. It's got a name, and the name is sort of, you can think of it as kind of like the label for the element, for lack of a better term. So in this case, because I've got a select element and it actually has a label element that it's associated with, its name is preferred seat type. An element can have state. It's optional. They don't all have states, but some of them can have states, so the select element state is collapsed. And it can have a value. And again, not everything has a value, but this one has a value of no preference because it's for selecting a seat type, so it could also be aisle seat or window seat or something like that. So what happens when you write HTML is the browser does two things. It creates a graphical user interface, but then it actually takes all of those DOM objects and it creates an accessibility tree. It's just a bunch of objects full of semantic properties, right? And that tree then gets handed off to assistive technology like a screen reader or something like that. And then that's how it actually speaks to the user and creates that spoken UI for them based on that accessibility tree, based on those semantics. So this is why semantics are really, really crucial in your application. And just like we saw with focusability, a lot of built-in elements have implicit semantics. So a password input field, like input type equals password, when you land on that, a screen reader like VoiceOver will just say secure edit text because it has an implicit role that's just built in there. Same with your button, same with your select element. Now, just like we saw with focusability, if you are building controls out of non-semantic elements, then you're going to miss out on all these freebies that the browser is trying to give you. So for instance, if I build a div button, and I land on that with a screen reader, instead of saying button or anything like that, it's going to say group. Because a div and a span and like section, all these things, well, section's actually kind of useful, but div and span, these are just generic grouping elements, right? So it says group. And that doesn't instruct a user to interact with this thing in any way, right? So again, you want to make sure that you're not fighting the platform. Whenever possible, you want to make sure that you're using native elements because you're going to get these semantics for free. And just as an aside, I hope at the end of this talk no one ever leaves this room and writes another div button, because if you do, I've failed basically all of you. So keep that one thing in mind. Just don't ever do that. I realize that there are times when you are going to need to go off-road. You're going to need to build a custom control. And so just like we saw with keyboard support, you need to add those semantics back in. And so you can do that using the Web Accessibility Initiative's Accessible Rich Internet Applications spec, or YARIA, or just ARIA. So basically, ARIA is a specification. It's a set of attributes that let you do surgery on that accessibility tree, right? It lets you add semantics to elements where previously they were missing. The one really important thing to understand about ARIA, though, is that ARIA does not change or affect the behavior or the way that an element works. So for instance, if you add ARIA attributes to something, it does not suddenly become keyboard, focusable or anything like that, right? It doesn't gain magical behavior power. It doesn't gain cool click handlers or anything. All ARIA does is add semantic information to an element. That's it. It's not going to, make it work with a tab key or anything like that. So it's just for adding semantics. So let me give you an example. I'll take a custom element that I was working on, and I'll show you how I added semantics to it to make it work better in a screen reader. So this was like a custom checkbox that I was building. And because it's a custom element, it's effectively like a span to the browser. So I got to add tabindex to make sure someone can land on it and they can focus it. But now I'm going to have this little box down here, and you can see inside this little box, I'll show you what the screen reader would say as I land on this element. So right now, because this is a new tag that is never seen before, it's so semantically uninteresting that if you land on it with a screen reader, it will just say nothing. It'll just sort of like sit there and be like, I don't know. So then the first question is, all right, I'm building a checkbox. What do I need to add to it to make it work in a screen reader? You have two options here. The first option, which is what I attempted, which is a bad option, is you can go look at the ARIA spec directly. And it comes with this very helpful diagram of all the supported attributes. don't do that. The better approach is to go back to that magical ARIA authoring practices doc that I showed you, the cheat sheet, right? Because right over there, 2.7, checkbox. There's a checkbox pattern, cool. So you click on that, and it'll actually just show you everything that you need to add to this checkbox to make sure that it works properly. It'll show you all the keyboard stuff at the top. It'll show you all the ARIA stuff at the bottom. So if I highlight this, you can see that it says my checkbox needs to have a role of checkbox. It's got to have an accessible label of some kind. And it's got to have an ARIA checked state of either true or false, depending on the state of the checkbox. Okay, cool. So I can do that. The first thing I'll do is I will give it a role. Okay. So I give it a role, and then look at this little box underneath it. This is my pretend screen reader here. So my pretend screen reader is going to now announce unchecked checkbox, right? Just based on that role. In the world of ARIA and the world of accessibility, the role attribute is like the most important attribute, okay? Everything falls out of the role. There are a lot of ARIA attributes which don't even work if they're not paired with the right role. So the first thing you want to get right is the role. And then you can see that it like defaulted to a state here just based on that role. So now it says unchecked checkbox. Cool. But obviously, it is a checked checkbox, so we got to change that. So the next thing we'll do is we'll add an ARIA checked attribute to it. And ARIA is a little weird. When you have like Boolean attributes, you have to actually pass like a string of true or false. This is just a unique quirk of ARIA. So I set it to ARIA checked equals true, and now you can see that the screen reader is announcing checked checkbox. Awesome. Now the last thing it said that I needed to do was to add a label of some kind. And there are a few options here for adding labeling. And labeling is super, super, super important in accessibility. So the first option is to add an aria-label attribute. And you can apply this directly to any element. And it's basically a string that can be used to override the accessible name for that element. So a really good use case for an aria-label attribute is on those little hamburger menus that we put on all of our responsive websites. So let's say you actually did use a button element for your hamburger menu. That's good, right? It's focusable. But you don't have any text associated with it. So when someone lands on that using a screen reader, it's just going to say button. Okay, button for what? Like send you my social security number button? Like I don't know what this button does, so I would probably never click that. So if I give it an ARIA label, I can have it announce main menu button, right? So nice, fix that problem. It's important to note that if your button has both text content and an ARIA label, only the ARIA label value will actually be announced to a screen reader user. So important to know that. Another option that we can use for labeling is aria-label by. So this lets you specify another element that you would like to use as your label. You can think of this kind of like using the native label element. The difference is that aria-label by will work for pretty much any HTML element, whereas the native label element, if I understand correctly, only works with like a handful of tags that are very specific, like input and stuff like that. So the cool thing about aria-label by is that you can use it to compose elements together to build like a more interesting, more complex label. So for instance, here I've got this Shop Now button. And when someone lands on it, it contains a little text that says Shop Now. So someone could land on this and it would say Shop Now button in my screen reader up there at the top. Okay, well that's cool, but like Shop Now for what? Like I'm trying to tell them that they're shopping for men's outerwear. So I can use aria-label by to refer to that other labeled element. So I can refer to that other label element by its ID. I can actually self-refer to the original button too. So I'm composing like a more complex label. And now my screen reader would announce men's outerwear shop now button. Nice. So this is probably what I want to use for that checkbox that I'm building. So I've got a little span down there with some text in it. And I'll just give that span an ID and associate it to my control here using aria-label by. Right? So now my screen reader would say sign up checkbox. Awesome. Now, if you are getting started with accessibility or you're trying to debug the accessibility in your app, there's a couple options that you can take. The first, and one that I would encourage all of you to do, is to learn a screen reader. If you have a Mac, you've got a screen reader already installed called VoiceOver. If you use Windows, there's a free screen reader called NVDA, or you could use Chromebox in Chrome. But it can be tedious to go through and look at everything on your page using a screen reader to verify things are doing what you want. So on the Chrome team, we've also been working on some new tools to help with this. So my teammate Alice Boxall has been building accessibility tools into Chrome's DevTools. So these are shipping in Chrome now. You go to your settings, and you go to the experiments panel. So these things are experimental, they might explode. But you go to accessibility inspection, and you restart your DevTools. You can go and you can inspect elements on the page and figure out all their semantic info. So this is like a form that I built. And you can see in the little DOM inspector, there's now an accessibilities tab. And I can look at this like input value, and I can see its role, I can see its, what it's labeled by and things like that. I can select this select element and see its current value and its state. So right now it's expanded false, for instance. So you can get all sorts of good inspectable semantic information using these new dev tools. This is also helpful if something is not showing up in a screen reader, and you can figure out like, oh, one of the parents is set to aria hidden or something like that. So really cool. This is shipping in Chrome stable now, so you should all have it on your browsers. To wrap up, again, if you're just getting started, go find that WebAIM checklist and nail the checklist. There's a really diverse range of users out there. You got to make sure you're not designing just for the way that you experience the world. So familiarize yourself with WCAG, familiarize yourself with the WebAIM checklist, figure out what your primary user journeys are in your application, and then ensure those journeys are accessible. Also, if you're building interactive controls, make sure that they are all reachable via the keyboard. If you haven't done it before, try tabbing through the site that you work on. If you've never done that before, it can definitely like hurt your feelings because you'll be like, oh wow, we have a lot of work to do. So try today, just like tab through your site. That is a quick and easy thing that everyone can do just to see if they've got a good keyboarding experience. And finally, make sure you're offering the right affordances in your app. So use native elements whenever you can because you're going to get really rich semantics. And when you need to go off-road, look at that ARIA authoring practices doc and use that to figure out what sort of semantics you need to add to your controls. Lastly, shameless plug, myself and Alice Boxhall, Alice created those accessibility dev tools. We put together a course recently. This is up for free on Udacity. So you go to bit.ly/web-ALMNY. You can probably do this course in like a couple days, but it covers everything you need for practical fundamentals to start kicking ass at accessibility today. So yeah, go check that out. And that is my time, so thank you all so much.